There we go.
Okay, got it.
Over to you, Ian.
Well, what would you like me to say? Sorry.
You can welcome everybody.
Oh, well, welcome everyone to NPA's Southern Sydney branch Tuesday night members meeting, and to continuing the wonderful series of videos that we've been producing. So, and tonight we have the honour of Brian talking to us about giving us a presentation on Kosciuszko. So I think that's all we need to say, isn't it, Brian?
That will be fine. Thank you, Ian. And I will acknowledge that I'm on Dharawal land, and I suspect that looking at the call, there are people from all over the state here, which means there's an awful lot of other lands that people are representing here, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. Thank you. Thanks, Ian, for coming online and chairing tonight's meeting, and you can keep an eye on the questions if you don't mind while I do the talking. And it is good to see a whole pile of people on the call who have walked in that park with me. And I might do something really drastic myself now and share my screen. And I take it that is...
Yeah, that's quite visible. Ready to go.
Yes, except that I need to make it big. And I keep forgetting how to do this on this.
Top right in the second icon there. Oh, no, the other way. The top left then on your side.
Ah.
Is it up there?
Grey banner from beginning.
And
sorry, where was...
Oh, well, if you want to, play from the beginning to get the thing going, yeah. Sorry, top left from the beginning.
Oh, that does it. Thank you. Thank you, David. I don't know how many times I really have been to Kosciuszko. It was about 5 or 6 years ago that friends of mine told me that this is your 50th multi-day walk in the park. I joined NPA way back in 1975, and I've been leading walks ever since 1977, which seems to be a fair stretch. And many of them were full pack walks throughout the park. You'll be pleased to know that there is absolutely no way in the world did I carry a camera for all of those 50 walks. And therefore, what I'm really going to be doing is just concentrating on the last decade or so. You don't need me to tell you how special this national park is, despite its many problems, and we will be touching upon a number of those. Gary Dunnett is going to be called in at some stage to talk about some of the ways we are dealing with it. But so too will Ted Woodley, who may or may not be here yet, but Ted may have trouble talking, given that he's going to be tuning in from a car coming back from visiting relatives on the Central Coast. I mentioned both Gary, who is our CEO, and Ted, who has done a huge amount of work on campaigning to stop the damage by Snowy 2, because they have been absolutely instrumental in making sure we who love the park will continue to have a park worthy of being loved. Don't know if I've covered all the problems. Snowy 2, weed infestation, feral horses, feral deer, feral pigs, fire, climate change. But I will make a particular mention of inappropriate recreational activities, and I've avoided writing this, but I will put it in any case. Some of the most appalling governmental planning approaches that I've ever had to deal with in my time in regional advisory committees or on the advisory council. That'll do at this stage. Yeah, I've told you how many multi-day walks that have been. There have been many other single-day walks as well, but come along and we'll have a look at them, and every so often I will actually do some basic talking, and I need to move that out of the way. It's big. 6,900 square kilometres is a very big national park. It is the source of the Snowy, the Murray River, the Murrumbidgee, the Gungahlin, and a whole host of other little bits as well. Way back into the late 70s, I think, maybe the early 80s, down on the Pilot, through the Pilot and down right onto the Victorian border, I think I ran into that other long distance bushwalker in the NPA, Mark Goodson, for the first time. Mark, I don't know if he's arrived or hasn't yet, but it was good to meet you down there, Mark. The park extends right through to the Victorian border, and there is national park beyond that, and in the north through into the ACT, and there's national park there. The Alpine National Park and the Namadgi, as well as Kosciuszko, are our peak alpine country. And I do remember a huge campaign that was being waged at one stage that's got nowhere yet, of seeing if we could put the entire alpine area into a World Heritage listing. Would be a nice dream, but there are a lot of problems to face. The higher regions of the park experience the alpine climate, and yet and while it's the most fragile ecosystem, it's probably one of the smallest bits in the park, considering all the other types of national park ecosystems there are. Kosciuszko actually used a designation of wilderness way before the Wilderness Act was brought in, though the Wilderness Act has been dumped over the top of it. So when you see the term wilderness in Kosciuszko, it actually does include effectively a precinct planning for the area. And I've got photos from an awful lot of those particular areas as we go. Jagungal has always been my favourite area. I remember one year, for some strange reason, known only to myself and probably to Faye, we actually crossed Jagungal 3 times from 3 different directions. Now, that is a seriously addicted person. And yet, there are still some special other areas that don't often get visited. I mentioned to Liz that Graham and I were on a long distance bushwalk way back in, I think, the early 80s. And I think it was Brian James who was the official leader of that, into the Pilot. I've been to the Pilot 4 or 5 more times since that first walk, including trips in to inspect the so-called horse riding trial in the wilderness, which we might talk about too later on. But down off the slope, down in the valley, down along the Snowy, you have that dry area, the Byadbo Wilderness, and it too is a very, very special spot indeed. Just to give you a feel for it, that's what the map actually looks like. You can see how far it extends up towards Canberra and all the way down. You can even see the hole, the big gaps on the eastern slope where there are still patches that would be nice to get. Down south of Jindabyne, there's a big loop there, and then on the way up towards Adaminaby, the one area that we often call the hole. The huge hill or set of ranges don't look anything from really the eastern side. If you drop over to the west on that western boundary and look back up, it really does look steep country indeed. I'm glad that I'm not going to be trying to walk some of those steep ridges anymore. I don't think my knees would take it anymore. So let's begin. One of my favourite spots is actually close to the centre, around Kyandra. In fact, there's a lovely dam there, the 3 Mile Dam, where you can camp, or it used to be lovely. The horses now gallop through it, unfortunately. It was part of the old diggings areas. And it is one of those spots that you can wake up early on early December. I usually choose early December when I go down there. I've avoided January like the plague because early December you can basically beat the flies. those damn horseflies or march flies or whatever you want to call them, that have become more and more prevalent, and I think are increasing as a result of all the horse shit everywhere. Anyhow, there's a nice camping area there if the horses don't make life difficult for you. And you can set up a very pleasant spot there. And Chris, I've drunk the odd glass of wine there in my time. It's also a lovely place, and I've got a name for this one, Kate, coming up later on, for finding orchids. And I don't know if Sukwan's tuned in at all, but she would love it down here at particular times of year. Keep an eye out for that one later on. I've put its name up and see if you can remember it. If you head up from that 3 Mile Dam up onto the ridge and past the old snowfields that got burnt down in the last fires and are being rebuilt, and keep walking south, you'll get to this hut. It was also destroyed in the last set of fires, but I think that, I don't know, some of you might have been in recently and tell me whether 4 Mile has been rebuilt. This is a big diggings area. You can see actually in the photo a lot of the diggings workings that are still visible. I should have contacted those two and got them to tune in. That's Gene Smith and Bob Small. Have spent many times with them in the park. It's a rather quaint little hut to go in, but I don't know about you people, but I have never been tempted to sleep in one of them. I figure outside in a tent is a lot less likely to have little animals eating through my tent to get at my food. It's a beautiful Caladinia, that. And I'm not going to talk your way through all the different flowers. Just go down there in an early December if the weather's changed, and you'll see fields of them. You also see evidence of the old high country grazing rights. And while certain farmers would love to get back up there, I'm going to give my first set of praise for the protection of this area to the soil conservation experts, who demonstrated that the hard-hoofed animals were destroying the fragile ecosystems that are there and needed to be removed. And that was even before the park was created. There's one of those little buggers. I don't know how many I've murdered. I'm sorry to say that I know I shouldn't be doing a cull of wildlife in the park, but forgive me. Daisies are everywhere. And a delightful walk. And here's where I'm going to ask Gary to step in a second, if you don't mind, Gary. This is on the Wallace's Trail. Now, the Wallace's Trail runs from that 3 Mile Dam north. At the top end of it, at the northern end, it's been obliterated, at least, quote, temporarily, for the building of testing tunnels for Snowy 2. And if I stop screen sharing at this stage and leave it where we are, we might have a little chat about some of the issues that we're facing. And before I get you, Gary, to have a little chat about Snowy 2, is Ted on the call? I don't see him.
I don't think so,
Peter.
Brian.
Yeah.
So, Gary, it will be you, if you don't mind.
All right. Well, look, I'm really not sure how much knowledge people have of the whole Snowy 2 program. So I don't want to sort of go all the way back into it. You know, Malcolm Turnbull's announcement some 6 years ago. But suffice to say that this is the largest infrastructure project that's ever been put forward in a national park in New South Wales. The only thing I can think of that's even comparable at a national level would be the uranium mine within Kakadu, and it's not really technically part of Kakadu at this point anyway. So this is a massive project. I'm sure everyone will be aware that NPA had been expressing really serious concerns about this right from the get-go. One of the great ironies of this project was that at the same time that Malcolm Turnbull was announcing that this was going ahead in Kosciuszko National Park, you had a research team from the Australian National University who were publishing a study of potential pumped hydro locations across Australia, and they identified 8,600 potential sites in New South Wales, not a single one of which was in a national park. So, you know, we've got this great irony that the scientific community was telling us that, yes, there's plenty of opportunities, you know, literally thousands of opportunities for pumped hydro in New South Wales, let alone more broadly across the nation, at the same time as the Commonwealth Government, with the agreement of the New South Wales Government, was saying, yes, we want to do pumped hydro, and by the way, we're going to put it in the middle of, you know, your largest national park, one of the most sensitive locations in the state. So extraordinary irony. But the area that Brian's talking about is part of the geotechnical testing. The actual project was touted as largely using existing infrastructure, and the key bits of the infrastructure were Tantangara and Talbingo reservoirs. The problem is that there's some 27 kilometres between those two reservoirs. So even though most of the structure of the power station and much of the tunnels is being built underground, they had to do a massive testing program to make sure that they could actually build it underground. Now, everyone will have heard of the famous Florence, which is one of the tunnel boring machines that was developed for or built for Kosciuszko. Florence very emphatically showed how difficult it was going to be to build these tunnels. She's taken well over a year to get 150 metres, you know, and the plans were all for about 7 to 10 kilometres distance a year. Part of the issue with Snowy 2 is that it is such a big engineering exercise. So it's got lots of elements of it which are just untested. You know, this is far and away the largest gap between two reservoirs for any pumped hydro scheme that we've been able to discover across the entire world. So it is genuinely groundbreaking in that sense. Its final footprint on Kosciuszko National Park, ultimately they talk about a mere 100 hectares, but the reality, and that is essentially the new concrete which will be impacting on the park. But the reality is that the environmental consequences of the project span thousands, if not tens of thousands of hectares across the park. Every time they tunnel through, they impact on groundwater. Every time they tunnel through, they have to dispose of millions of cubic meters of spoil. And most of that spoil is in fact going into the reservoirs in the park. Some of it's going out of the park. A lot of it stays in the park. There's a lot of pollutants associated with those spoil, including asbestos-bearing rocks. So it has an extraordinary footprint that it's going to place on the park. Our hope as an organisation was that we could at least minimise the impact of pretty much the only discretionary part of the project. So either it wasn't going to happen or it was going to happen, but the discretionary part was actually the way they do the electrical connection between the new power station and the edge of the park. That's the transmission connection. The plan and management said it had to be underground. Unfortunately, the New South Wales government, through the then Minister for Environment, James Griffin, changed the plan and management so that transmission connection could be above the ground, which means that you've then got an easement of about 120 to 140 metres that slashed through 8 kilometres of park. That huge environmental impact could have been avoided by going underground. And we actually went to court on that. We had a significant battle in the Land and Environment Court. Unfortunately, we're unsuccessful, and so the overhead transmission connection is continuing. And just to bring this piece to an end, one of the key reasons why we fought so hard against this transmission connection through Kosciuszko was the concern that this would set a huge precedent for the rest of the rewiring of the transmission system across New South Wales. If you think about places like Sydney and Newcastle and Wollongong, which are the primary places that draw down power, they're all surrounded by national parks. And so the last thing we wanted was a precedent that it was okay to build new overhead connections through national parks. Unfortunately, that's where we are, and we're having to do a lot of policy work and advocacy and political campaigning to try and avoid similar impacts on those iconic parks around Sydney and the Illawarra and Newcastle. And that's a challenge which is ongoing. That'll do me for the moment, Brian. Really happy to take questions at the end or later. Yeah.
Yes, and I was going to suggest if anybody does have a question or two to Gary directly, and I thank Gary not only for what he just said, but for the amount of time he has put into trying to protect the planning process, as well as Kosciuszko National Park. It must have been exhausting for him, over and above the call of duty as far as I'm concerned. So if there's anybody got any questions, I will not start the share screen yet. I'll just keep an eye on the chat, or you can just put your hand up if you know how. The reactions button on the bottom of the page is where you find the hand up. And I jump from one page to the other. Either they didn't like what you're saying, Gary, or they like it so much they've got nothing to say. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. Then I will go back to sharing. And so that's on the Wallace's tracker, as we said earlier on before we went straight in. With more daisies. Isn't it nice to, instead of worry about the politics of it, you just look at why you go there in the first place? Ken Griffiths should be here for this one. I love the variations you get in blue-tongued lizards across the country. The different races, they all come up, they all look very, very different. And I threw in two sets of orchids there. The sun orchid on the left and the Prassophyllum or leek orchid on the right. Stretched a bit because I tried to fit both of them on the one page, but hey. And the bulbine lilies. And more delightful walking in that ridge country that falls dramatically off down to, if I'm looking there, it's to my left, it drops down into the ravines. So we go back to the Kiandra area the next year, and I put them in again as because you are going to see that you never take Kosciuszko for granted. That's a grey currawong, that bird, by the way. And you've got some beautiful corybus coming up there that you don't get in the Sydney area. But as we came in for this particular campsite, that's what it looked like as we drove up from Cooma over Sawyers Hill. The year before, it was in the 30s degrees temperature. This time we had to scrape a huge amount of snow away before we could pitch the tent. It can change very, very quickly. And this is the best view you'll see this trip, unfortunately, of Jagungal. There it is way in the distance, but it still looks beautiful with the snow on top, doesn't it? And here we are walking in the snow. One of the ironies is, and I think it's an irony, some of the people who are campaigning to stop feral horses in the park are doing so in order to protect the feral trout. Trout fishing is very popular, but it is an introduced species. And I know we were fighting for a much smaller fish than that to protect. This daisy is a lovely daisy. It comes in big, big clusters all over the place. And you all know how much I love butterflies. I suspect those of you who know me, the painted ladies were coming out in full force, as was the Maclay's swallowtail. I even am rather fond of these. I've often thought that one of the nicest things about this particular spider, the wolf spiders, is how parental they can be. If you've ever seen those little grass wolf spiders in your lawn, looked up closely to them, you may have seen the mother with about a whole pile of little babies on her back as she scuttles around through your lawn. It's just wonderful to watch the way they look after them. And of course, Kiandra was a major gold field with a huge number of pubs at one stage, and behind it's left a number of the people were there. The weather must have changed dramatically because it was Kiandra that had some of the first skiing that ever occurred in Australia. So we move on, and this time we're looking at, well, some delightful birds in the area and button daisies. And this is covering my, that's better. I might go back a bit if I can. No, it's still covering. That's the other that is, by the way, Monticola. If I can't, oh yeah, Diurus Monticola. I can see it below the screen sharing now. That was the earlier one that I asked you to keep an eye on. I don't know if Liz is back yet from her gym session, but there she is wondering why in the hell I'm pointing the camera at her. And these vanilla lilies are beautiful. So we head north. I warned you, Carol. There you are. No one will be ever not get photographed if they're wearing a hat like that. We stayed this time in the Talbingo area. Headed up into that steep climb. Nowadays, that road is heavily being used by the trucks backwards and forwards, all the contractors who are helping to build all that Snowy 2 infrastructure left, right and centre. And none of us can now officially get down into the Lobs Hole area. So it might be difficult now to get out to the Landers Fall lookout. I'm not sure. It's out on and off that area. It's a very steep spot. I've often wondered why they bother building these things. You could stand on the rocks and get a very good view anyhow. And that's the falls that you get the view from towards. The Janama homestead is no more. It was once a very impressive house. That's what it now looks like. That's the most impressive part of it. Always worth checking out some of these things. There's a fair bit of rubbish around it. It must have a lot of tales to be told if you do it, but often you see associated with these old homesteads that were there once before the park, a huge number of introduced plants. And the introduced plants, even if there is no building, often hints that there was once some sort of settlement there. Urangabilly village itself is reduced basically just to this hut, and this hut has burnt down since I took this twice, I think, and been replaced each time. This was taken for a regional advisory committee chairs meeting that was held in Tumut at one stage, and we had a good exploration to see just how these sites were being managed, and particularly we were looking at patches that Snowy Hydro were rehabilitating from the first building of the sites. In other words, they'd stayed damaged for at least 50 years and still in many cases are damaged. Not sure how many of you have been down to Urangabilly Caves. This is the caves house that has been rehabilitated. The original part is the low bit to the left of the photo. The two-story bit on the other side has been rehabilitated beautifully to include ensuite facilities in some of the rooms and a major kitchen as well. And it is a nice spot to stay. That's the area where you can sit around and chatter about the world after you've been bushwalking, or after you've had, in my case, several meetings when I've stayed down there. And I think I saw Helen on the call. I saw several Helens on the call, but I hope that's Helen Zemmett as one of them. And Carol, I did have to put in a certain picture or two to remember a very special bushwalking friend of ours. That, for those of you who have not met him, Jim Romanovsky is no longer with us, a victim of a bushwalking accident and one of the nicest people I've ever bushwalked with. I am totally mystified as to how Snowy 2 ever worked out that they could drill from Tentengra down to Talbingo and avoid going through karst country. They swore that they knew what was under there when I asked them way back in 2016. This was before Florence got stuck, and it demonstrated that they didn't have a clue. And I am sure that there are other issues that they're going to find further on down the track. So we head this time from the northern end of Wallace's Track, which begins near Bullock's Hill Horse Camp on Copper Mine Trail. And as I said, that is what happens to frost down there when it pops out of the ground and opens it up. I think there's a technical geological term for that. Somebody can tell me later on. This part is heading down to the beginning of the Wallace's Trail. This is the copper mine part. I mentioned before how quickly it drops off when you look down the other way. Quite steep slopes. And there is my in-memory photo. Thank you, John. Frost heave, everybody. Okay, now heading down into the Long Plain. Now, some of this is going to lead to the other big issue we're talking about. Long Plain says exactly what it sounds like. It is a very long, open plain, devoid of trees except in small patches on the ridge lines. And once one of the most stunning areas I've ever been to. In fact, that particular photo there looks pretty good condition. Probably because it's protected by some of that rock. You can see how the trees cling to the tops, and the snow and the frost hollows are devoid basically of vegetation. Now, however, you're going to start seeing an impact on the actual grass itself. Corango is in this area. There's a lovely couple who own it. You can actually stay there overnight, and there's a couple of cottages that you can hire in as well, and they will provide meals. The lady who is there, I think she's still there. There's a lovely Thai lady who knows exactly how to do a good Thai meal. with her partner, but, and this is a big but, very close by, is a horse camp for the horse riding fraternity. And there is now, unfortunately, an awful lot of horse shit there, not too far away. Oh, and David thinks it should be needle ice. Okay. So we're looking down over Long Plain. And I should now talk about Di, who is not with us today. She was going to try to get here. Di Thompson and I sat on the advisory council together for 8 years, she representing the Nature Conservation Council and I the NPA. Di is still on the Regional Advisory Committee for the Kosciuszko area. And for about 30 plus years, she has fought against both the feral horse problem and the horse riding lobby, who have trashed so much of this particular area, this particular park. She also has a penchant for colouring her hair, so forgive her. In the same area as this old Coolerman hut, well, stopping at again, and some of the evidence of the old settlements. I put this one in at the bottom end of it, very close to Coolerman hut, is the Blue Waterholes. It's a beautiful spot, or it should be. It's that blue colour that you get when water is sitting on karst, and it is karst country. And I don't think that anybody here is going to report me when I say that there are commercial horse riding groups who are illegally entering this karst country and could be very well polluting some of the most important karst waters around. Hiding in under a lot of this are caves. You can see the hole up there. And you actually can walk in and around and underneath, and you can find the cave critters deep, deep, deep inside. Not all the karst country in the park has been mapped as well, but the one expert that if ever you need to find out a bit more about this karst country is a guy called Andy Spate, who has been quite a tower of support for anybody interested in this. You can see how much limestone there is there. And you know I'm going to throw in the odd bird photo or two. So we go from flame to scarlet. Can you see the difference? The cheap way is to see that the flame's red goes mostly all the way to the throat, and the scarlets have got a black line underneath. Right up to the north again, Warragong Sugarloaf Walk. This is up along the edge of the Blowering Dam. A rather contentious spot, actually, because Blowering had a rehabilitation program with a whole pile of replantings, which may or may not have been the precursor to the argument we had with the NPWS about how they tried to rehabilitate, in inverted commas, some of the lands out on the western side of the Blue Mountains. Hey, Deb, you'll get you to talk about that at one stage tonight, if you don't mind. In fact, why not now? Deb, if I can get you to, yeah.
What did you want me to talk about, Brian?
You know how we get some awful plantings happening out there in your territory.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if the ones you're talking about there are related to the capity plantings that were done in incredibly bad techniques, with little respect for the environment, using bulldozers and tractors and ploughing up the earth. And in the face of all the disturbance and destruction and planting trees too closely, they invigorated all the weed propagules and caused massive weed outbursts. And yeah, So certainly not the way, was not regeneration, it was tree farming.
Yeah, and that's, I looked at Blowering like that beforehand, and I think that slopes up from Blowering, while they probably are the right trees, were done in rows and in clusters that reminded me of what you were talking about at Capity, Deb. Yeah. Oh, and I now see, now I've gone off screen, that Liz has arrived. I hope, Liz, you arrived in time to see yourself in the photos. Okay, I'm not sure. I think there's just I'm back to sharing. So let's move on. All the slopes, by the way, from Blowering up to the top of the ridge look all right, but they are very steep coming down. And I did have a chat with somebody the other day about it, who did admit that somebody who came down that hill just before them had fallen and done the ankle in, and they were quite wary of it. But it does give you a good view north towards the Tumut Township here. And you can see that the vegetation up here is very different to the other parts of the park. It's also got a reasonably healthy population of emus in this area. Back down to Urangabilly. And this time we're checking for management issues. And I should put in an apology for Anne Reeves, who has another meeting tonight. Next to Anne in the blue beanie is Di again, and then Alex Goodwin, who was before Gary, our CEO. With the other two people are ACT NPA people. This is one of those boreholes that Gary was talking about when they were checking. They only did a handful to check just what was underground before they expected Florence to dig that hole. And now we get into issue number, well, big one, 2. This tree has been used in a camping ground to tie a horse up to. You can see the damage right around the base of that tree. And I could repeat that over and over again. This area in the Long Plain, you can now see, has been denuded of vegetation around the river courses, and it's breaking up. You can see that the tops of the streams that were once deep and sharp-edged and beautiful and fresh have now been trampled all over by horses' hooves and are now muddy. This place, which was once one of those little places where you could disappear to and hide, is now being trampled and used by the horses all around it. You can see again the damage in that creek. Though I've got a sneaky suspicion that some of that might be another problem as well, and that's pig damage. And please don't tell me that they look cute. I have spent a lot of time trying to tell people that deer in national parks here should be called venison, and I'm happy for you to call this glue. Now here with the advisory council people inspecting the site, only about 2 weeks after. You can't help but notice all the horse hooves all over that, treading it all down. It is a clapped out paddock. It's even a paddock worse than any farmer would call a paddock. That's how bad it has got. Back inside the Urangabilly home hut, this is the area which has the en-suites on it. Quite comfortable to look at. And inside Urangabilly Cave itself, I have been fortunate enough to go in with some of the speleologists who are actually able to talk to me a little bit more about how they manage it and what dangers they have. And one of the problems they have is another problem that I never imagined this would be an issue. But one of the biggest problems they have in protecting karst are fires, because the smoke causes all sorts of issues, and the constant burns cause all sorts of issues also to the quality of the water. You've seen that enough times, that building. So now let's concentrate on the high country. And that's a male common brown, that particular butterfly, up on in the area between Perisher and Charlotte Pass. There's always some snow on the high country, I guess, the main range. And while these particular beetles are nice, they are actually devastating at the moment. Some of the snow gums, they were out of control on the snow gums. You know how so many of those eucalypts in the Monero were knocked over and are dead and look awful. This is a different infestation. The other ones down there were attacked, were weevils. These Christmas beetles, as they're called, were absolutely taking out some of the snow gums in quite big numbers in that area. The ranunculus are gorgeous. So many different types. I have no idea how to separate them as a species, so I'll need my botanist friends to come down with me next time. Occasionally, one needs a rest. Oh, it's a perfect place to do it. Even with the Wallenbergias in flower. We're now in the waterfall country around the Granite Falls down near Sorpet Creek. A nice little loop walk, by the way. Don't always just go straight up to the top and get in the traffic jams at Charlotte Pass. There are some beautiful other walks that you can do, and this is one of them. And I did mention earlier on that the Biadbo down along the Snowy River is a rather special spot. It's very dry. It's in a rain shadow because of most of the rain gets dumped up on top. And the river here was exceedingly low this year, and is artificially low, of course, because it's being held back in Jindabyne behind the dam. But still, nevertheless, worth going down. And you get brown tree creepers, you get speckled warblers, you get rufous whistlers, but they're pretty standard along a lot of the places. Vera has asked whether the dead snow gums going out to Porcupine Rocks, which is the area I was just talking about, were they caused by beetles or by the bushfire? Combination, Vera. Some of them were knocked over by the bushfire. Many of them have been hit by the beetles since then and knocked over badly. Yeah. I love these little thornbills. It was many, many years ago that Faye and I and a couple of other friends were down there walking in the Biadbo wilderness. It was really hot. We'd been up on the high country from up in the Pilot and dropped down some of the ridge lines down into the Biadbo. And we'd gone through past a hut. The hut's no longer there. But in it was a kerosene fridge that was still working. I thought, oh my God, right in the middle of a heat wave, they've got a kerosene fridge operating with no one around. I reported it to the rangers, but they said to me straight away, you don't need to worry, and I'll tell you why. We got out that day as soon as we could, because straight down that valley we could see smoke. A big bushfire came through. That bushfire took out not only the hut, but all their beer. I should have just helped myself with it while we were there. Another little nice track, again going up from Sawpit Creek and up the valley towards Perisher, etc., is Rennick's track. It's an in-out job, and it is exceedingly attractive grasses, but it does have this pig damage along it. And at this stage also, I should mention that this area is now being infested by a deer population that's out of control. Mostly fallow deer in this area, though I believe sambar are also making an appearance. It is one of the copper blues, that one. It's not the common grass blue. You can help me with all those. The blues, there are about three or four pages of blues that are, it's very difficult to tell them apart. I do like this little echidna's headdress. It's rather attractive. Over on the other side, dropping down through Dead Horse Gap, down to the bottom onto the Murray River, you get a totally different feel in the park. You look back up at the major slopes that you've just come down, wondered why you ever walked them in the past. Those slopes often have a problem of blackberry. Some of these areas also now have problems of illegal horse use, and also legal because they changed the rules to allow horse riding there and encourage it in some areas. But it's still pretty country if you can manage to avoid those bits. And I'm sure it's a favourite spot for fishermen. I think we're nearly near the end of this. The Palabo track is a very unknown track, really. It won't be, because it actually goes from the campsite at the top of the hill near Sawpit Creek, the huts, down to the Snowy River at the bottom. At the bottom, the Palabo track runs into what's called the Thredbo Valley Way, the TVT track, which is a multi-use track. And this is the sort of facilities they're now building along it to protect it, but also to allow mountain bikers to use it. And when we were there this December, this December past, the river was in flood. These are patches of land that still have yet to be rehabilitated since they were grazed. And this is the bridge that they've built across the river there to go to the trout hatchery, for those of you who know the area rather well. That's a lot of money that's gone in just to allow the odd mountain bike to get through. And I do love Prostanthera. I can't resist when I walk past Prostanthera of pinching a leaf and squeezing it and smelling the mint smell. The high country again, a bit less snow by I think we're now by Christmas time or just before Christmas. And the alpine copperheads. And I think, yes. I need Ken to triple check that. That's an anemone, but that's a ranunculus, believe it or not. It's a beautiful ranunculus. It only comes out a very short period of time out of the snow, just after the snow melts. And this is what the Snowy River was looking like when we were up there, when I turned it into a little bit of bleak feel because it was very bleak the day we were here for this particular photo. It was the day of the run from the coast down near Eden to the top of Kosciuszko. We were there as the winner ran past us. We cut across the hill to drop down to the Snowy, and then runner number 2 arrived, and runner number 3 came behind. Runner number 2 went into cramp, and I thought he's never going to get there. And that's runners 2 and 3 limping their way to the top, while runner number 1 is already on the way back down the hill. And we this time stayed in Jindabyne, and that's where we were looking out over the land. And this, folks, is really just the end. The hyperlinks there are straight to NPA's own pages, which allow you to see in more detail what campaign we're doing on Snowy 2, and what we've also done to the feral horses. And this will be shared, this particular presentation. And I do especially, as I've said already, want to thank Ted Woodley, Di Thompson, and of course, Gary Dunnett for all the work that they've done. I also like to acknowledge the Invasive Species Council, who have done a huge amount of work. And thanks for coming along, folks. Here for questions and or comments anytime you want. I think that's just a hand clap from Liz. I don't think she wants to ask a question. That's nice of you, Chris. Any questions or comments?
A question to Gary Dunnett. Gary, what were the grounds that by which the Snowy case was sadly lost?
Look, there are a couple of things, Ian, but it really hinged on a view from the Chief Judge of the Land and Environment Court that the minister really was free to make whatever decision he or she wanted to on the plan of management, and that there was little, if any, obligation on NPWS to actually publish the reasons why they were proposing to amend a plan of management, in this case to allow the overhead transmission. It was incredibly disappointing, and it's, you know, when I talk about political advocacy, what we're really focusing on at the moment is what changes do we need to put in place to plan a management practice to not have this basically represent a descent to, you know, just purely tokenistic planning. There has to be some meaning to what goes on to public exhibition, and that wasn't really apparent in the case of the Snowy 2 decision. I've got to say, it followed a not dissimilar case that was in the federal courts for the Northeast Forest Alliance. Sort of took the Commonwealth to task over the extension of the regional forest agreements. And again, the judge in that case, well, in fact, the panel of judges in that case, decided that ministers can sort of do what they bloody well want to. There's not a lot of constraint about sort of following any reasonable process of public information or justification, which was all pretty disappointing, to be honest.
We'll have to break up that autocracy for the ministers.
Well, I mean, where it takes us is, look, I think a lot of people have had experience with various development processes where you sort of think, oh, am I just going, you know, is this just pure tokenism when I'm putting in submissions on a development application, for instance? And the reality is that in most parts of the planning system, that's absolutely the case. But there was always this sense that for protected areas, because there was that whole thing of the management plan, the plan and management, that there was a bit more meaning to public submissions. But this is sort of unfortunately stripped away that possibly that, you know, unwarranted confidence that we had a better planning system when it came to national parks and other protected areas.
Thank you.
Ross.
Look, thanks, Brian. It was great. I'm just a little concerned about the focus on the negative that does prevail because there are negatives, and I'm just wondering, given the amount of time you've been there, have you got a view around how its values are being managed, and is it still an absolutely wonderful place to go? And is it improving or declining in any noticeable sense in a broad level?
The high country is still lovely. They have improved the management of the high country by stopping camping around the alpine lakes, for example. I believe that most of the tracks that they've put in have actually kind of helped by controlling people's access to pretty sensitive vegetation. It's been a while since I've been in that Pretty Plains Jagungal area, but I believe that that is still horse-free and still beautiful. The place is beautiful, whatever management does or doesn't do, because it's got that wildflower country. And when you see it, you love it. It has been clobbered by a greater intensity of bushfires than I think that the alpine areas should be able to deal with, but that's not management's problem. That's a bigger problem beyond management. I mean, those big burns in the mountain ash country should not happen more than 70 years apart. Otherwise, you get into serious trouble with replacement. I still go back. I mean, I was there twice for two separate blocks of almost a week at a time in November and December in this last year, and enjoyed it. The weather is part of it. I absolutely love that. One thing, Ross, that I will though say is that I do not envy the NPWS staff there. They are more and more having to retreat into almost bunkers to protect themselves from the horse riding lobby. They're being told, there are big signs up everywhere saying no photographing of NPWS staff. And I had a chat with a few at one of the spots, and they were saying, look, it's becoming very, very bad, and we're more and more, we actually even shut ourselves behind our barricades so that we can't be accessible, which is a pity. If you turn yourself off that, the beauty of the high country is there. And it is better managed than the Victorians, because the Victorians have still call, I think they still call deer game. You might be able to correct me on that. Or is it now a feral animal down there too? It was for a long time managed under the Game Act, which meant that the hunters and shooters had a favourable ability to do what they wanted with them, and they wanted to keep them. No, Ross, I think some of the photos of the flowers in the countryside said that it's rather attractive and still beautiful. I just want it to be better managed, and I want us to be able to continue to fight for it. That might do me. What I don't want to see, though, is that the staff are left out in the limb without a community group helping them. Yeah. Gary?
I want to turn to the positive side as well. And, you know, given the very strong photographic sort of thread that runs through all of your presentations and reports, Brian, if you had to stick with one camera, one lens, what would you be carting around the high country?
Oh, that's a hard question.
And the second one is that I've seen lots of images of that sort of fantastic gorge country, blue water holes, I think it's called, from Fishers, but I've never actually seen a landscape photographer go in there. Have you ever actually done a bit of an explore
Are you
through that
talking
gorge
about
country?
are you talking about blue water holes?
Yeah,
Or are
blue
you
water
talking
holes,
about
yeah.
the Lob Hole area?
No, I think it's Clark's Gorge and what's the other one?
Because I did have photos of the blue water holes. That was
Okay.
that's the karst country.
Right, okay.
I
All right, well, back to the lens then.
back to the lens.
A big zoom that covers it.
Yeah, no. The big zoom and the bird photographs were usually short walks from a campsite. And or a drive down through the Snowy Valley. I am not going to be doing a 3-day, 4-day, 5-day. And the longest walk I ever did there was a 9-day full pack walk. I'm not going to be carrying a 400mm lens on one of those walks. In fact, it's basically a little point and shoot then. For most uses nowadays, Gary, with the modern technology, I'm taking an electronic mirrorless, which is lighter. And I probably, if I was going to choose anything, I would throw in 2 lenses, an 18 to 70 basically, and a 60mm macro.
Good to see that you're incapable of saying just one. But equally pleased that you didn't say your phone.
No. Is Elaine still on the call? I think she may have escaped.
Ted's on the call.
No, I've mentioned Elaine in particular because there you are, hiding. Turn yourself on, Elaine. Foon, in case you can't see that particular name, not Elaine Lau, the other Elaine. She goes out and takes a brilliant set of photos just with her mobile phone. You don't have to be too shy about it, Elaine. Or maybe she's hiding in other ways too. Okay. Will that do, Gary, those 2 lenses? It's only a little one, the second one. Any other questions? I do still think that if I was going to go anywhere, my favourite spot down there is the Jagungal area.
Hey, Brian, I have a couple of questions if you don't mind.
I don't mind, John. I've got it all night. Well,
Okay. So regarding the feral host problem, I often read from the news that either the federal government or the state government is planning to do an aerial shooting.
now
Is that going to solve the problem?
And they're going to have to take out an awful lot.
Mhm.
I said I don't mind having a couple of horses left over so long as they're both males, but I don't think that they're going to go for that number. They're talking about keeping 3,000 there. That's a big number because they're estimating at this stage that the population is probably closer to 24,000. And that's a lot of carcasses. It's a lot of food for dingoes, for wedge-tailed eagles, and for the little ravens. But it's also a lot of angst. So I know that quite a bit of the park is going to be shut down, and that's causing some anger by some of the community members. But quite a bit of the park will be shut down while that cult is occurring over this coming season, when lots of the bushwalkers they won't happen over Easter, but it'll probably happen straight after that.
Right.
Yeah.
My second question is this Snowy 2 project. Is that actually affecting the wilderness designated place in Kosciuszko National Park?
The damage is certainly going to be occurring from the Tantangara Reservoir, which is not in wilderness, through and underneath the country, that complex geology that drops down into Talbingo. It's not wilderness there either, but it is going to be clearing way a lot what Gary was saying about where the transmission lines are going. I've often wondered how Talbingo Reservoir was so big that 80% of it has capacity to take dump, to spoil. And if I were an accountant, I would have said, why did you build it so big if it was 80% bigger than it was required in the first place? So no, not wilderness as declared as such, but certainly damaging. Gary's got some more to add on that.
Yeah, look, I was just going to say that, look, I don't want to suggest that wilderness is not important, but what we need to recognise that in New South Wales, and in fact in most jurisdictions, wilderness has a legal definition, and it's got to be a certain size, and it has to have had very little historic sort of impact within that space. And as Brian says, the transmission lines and the rest of the work in Kosciuszko was largely outside of the defined wilderness. But, you know, there's not a square centimetre of, for instance, Royal National Park that you could ever define as wilderness, and yet you wouldn't want to see damage to the habitats within that. And that's really, I think, the frame we've got to take, that wherever possible, we should be looking to not have parts of national parks impacted by development. It really is that simple. And the thing that was really disappointing, I think, about the whole Snowy program was that Snowy 2 program was that we just couldn't convince government that they needed to have a higher standard when it came to developing within a national park than in any other development site. That was in my mind, the big failure of government to grapple with the fact that this is a really precious place. And look, you know, it's largely done. You know, the worst of the impacts are already done, but just tells us that we've got to be so careful about the rest of our protected areas across New South Wales so that this doesn't become a sort of a pattern.
Completely agree on that.
And note that there are two definitions of wilderness that are in play in Kosciuszko in any case. One's just a management tool wilderness, as I mentioned, that were there even before the Wilderness Act came in. Yeah, I forgive you, Elaine. You're back again now.
Yes.
The lady who is now shown on screen, PHOON there, she is the lady who goes out with nothing other than a mobile phone.
I've got two mobiles though.
All right, 2 mobile phones, and takes the most extraordinary photos.
Thank you.
And for those of you in the branch, she's the one responsible for the article in the last newsletter of the wildlife that we find in the rock pools around our coast. All with that damn mobile phone.
I know.
Making me feel absolutely terrible about the amount of expensive gear that I have here.
Yeah, but I can't shoot bird photos. That's the only thing.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? I did note that somebody who walked down there with us in the early 80s was online before, and I couldn't interrupt me talking to say hello to her, and she's gone already. I don't know if you noticed that Helen Sanderson was on the call. Who bravely walked Hennell's Spur with us, I might add, many years ago. Down.
Brian, I just might add, I had the good fortune to do a symposium down there with the Linnaean Society.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that was brought out was just how, for people that perhaps hadn't had that experience, the Kosciuszko National Park represents an alpine region which is unique in the world. It's a lot lower and in altitude, and it's a whole lot older geologically than many of the alpine regions of Europe, which are much younger and steeper and full of snow, whereas this is a far lesser altitude, and it distinguishes itself because of the sheer diversity of plants, because it's not covered in snow so much. It's absolutely unique. So I think we've got to preserve it and value it from that aspect. It is a one-off alpine area in the world.
It is indeed. It's beautiful.
Mm.
And Deb, the answer to your question, for those of you who didn't see, Deb, does it have a proper botanic map for the entire park? I don't know. You probably know better than me, Deb.
I don't think it's at the standard that the mapping that's been done more recently with
Yeah.
national parks on the East Coast and certainly around the Greater Sydney area. So I think it's pretty incredible that it's such a unique environment and such a unique park, and we don't have a, thorough, up-to-date vegetation map for such a unique part of our country.
Yes. I mean, it's such a big park, isn't it? I mean, let's face it.
Mm.
And I think she's just left us, but it was good to see Daintree call in from the mid-north coast as well. And she just said thank you. And I wasn't able, I'll send her a special message to say thanks.
Right.
Thanks for the talk, Brian. It's terrific.
Carol, it's so lovely to see you. I hope you didn't mind all those photos.
It wasn't too many. No, they were lovely photos to see. Thank you for including them.
Yeah, look, I had to, Carol. It was a special trip or two we've had down there.
Yeah, it was. It
Yeah.
was. You referred to some areas being karst country,
Yep.
karst water. I don't understand what that means.
Karst is a smart way. Ian will tell you all the details about this. He's a geologist, but it's a smart way of describing the limestone country where you can get all those caves.
I see.
Yeah. Jenolan is karst country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Will that do, Ian? Is that good
Yeah,
enough?
that's
Did I pass
perfectly
geology one?
satisfactory. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Gary, there's a map of plant community types. Is probably not as detailed as Deb would expect, I think, Gary. How many of those are done just as aerial surveys and forget to look at the lower stuff?
That's the problem. They are interpolation of aerial data,
Yeah.
so they need to be ground checked. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, where data sets in what detail, David?
That you can use for like map-based layers.
Yeah, again, I think that's the generic stuff, isn't it? I don't think it's what Deb would expect to be high quality vegetation mapping.
That'd be interesting. I'll have a look.
Yeah, yeah. Well, folks, it being 8:30, that means I've been rabbiting, or we've been rabbiting on now for an hour and a half. If there's any more questions, we'll have a chance for them. Otherwise, Ian, I think I'll hand it back over to you.
Well,
Or I could show everybody a 3-minute video, and it would be giving everybody 6 seconds to write down each of the bird species in the video. Or do I do that next time and make them suffer badly?
oh, look, 3 minutes is nothing in the field.
No, not today. Not today.
Hour and a half. If
No,
you, if
Yeah.
you
we should
really,
go for it,
really.
Brian.
All right. Over to you, Ian.
Look, Brian, thanks again for a fantastic presentation. Kosciuszko, the more you get to know about it, becomes so precious to all of us. I'm sure all of us who watched your presentation went to places in Kosciuszko we've never been before, or perhaps some of us anyway, and I'm sure they would have appreciated that. So, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ian. It's absolutely lovely to see so many people who have been bushwalking down there with me on the call at different times tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
I'll stop recording.
And you can probably turn us all off too, can't you?